So to find a percentage of something, we would do a couple of different things. Now we see percentages everywhere. We see them on your phone battery, we see them in the shops. You might see things like 20% off, or it's 50% of its usual price. Or someone might say, well, what is 25% of 20? Well, you might just know some of these off the top of your head. You might know that 50% is the same as half, or you might know that 25% is the same as a quarter. And you might just then know, oh, well, I know that a quarter of 20 is 5. So if you just use your fractions and decimal and percentage equivalents, you might just know them off the top of your head. But when you don't, you would need to do other things. So have a look at these examples. So you are lucky for these, you do get to use a calculator. There's a simple rule for working out any percentages, but they're not necessarily simple to work out. So for example, have a look at these. So the rule is, I divide by 100, then I times by my percentage. I'll show you the first example and it might make that slightly clearer. So I'm dividing by 100, I wonder if you can work out why. Well, the reason is because 1% would give me a good starting point. And if I divide my number by 100, I'll get 1%. A percentage, percent, means for every 100. So if I split this into 100 tiny pieces, I've got 1%, and then I can times it by 31 to get 31%. So I start by doing 70 divided by 100, so there's my first step, which, like I said, feel free to use a calculator. That would be 0.7. And then I times it, so 0.7 is 1%. Then I times it by my 31, and that will give me my final answer. Not got much space. So to show you that again, I started with my whole, so my 70 was my whole thing, divided by 100 because that gives me 1% of it, which was my 0.7. But I don't just want 1%, I want 31%. So I multiply my 0.7 by 31 to give me my final answer. I'll show you another one. If I was trying to find 52% of 18, like I said, I get my 1% first by dividing by 100, which would be 0.18, and then I times that by my 52, and that gives me, with a calculator, 9.36. Nice and simple. But if you didn't have a calculator or you wanted to challenge yourself, another way you can do it is using one of these. Now I showed you this with the fractions, but this is similar, but this is for percentages. So in the middle, I've got 100%, and that's where I put my starting number. So let's say that I was trying to find something percent of 70. Let's say I want to find 52% of 70. So I put my 70 in the middle, and then I work my way out. Now I have to follow my little lines, and I'll put a link to these so you can print them off if you want to. So if I start maybe going down, I do my 10% first. So 100% would be 70, meaning 10% is 7. Now these lines take me either here, here, or here. For this purpose, I'm going to choose to go over here. Any way is fine, as long as I'm using the lines. So I'm going to go to 90%. Now I could either do 9 lots of 7, because it's 90 and that's 10, or I could actually think to myself, well, if 100% is 70 and I take away 7, that's taking away my 10%, that will give me the same thing. So if 100% is 70 and I take away the 7, that means 90% would be 63. Now I can go back to here and start working onto this branch. So if 10% is 7, then 1% is going to be 10 times less than that, which is 0.7. 2% is then going to be double that, 1.4. And then I've got a similar situation over here where it's asked me for 99%. Well, if I just take my 1% away from my whole, I'll get that. So 0.7 taken away from 70 would be 69.3. Lovely, I've now done 2 of my branches, so I can start working down here. 10% is 7. Now if I want 20, I'm doubling that to give me 14. And then 40% would be double it again. And 80% would be double it again. There we go. If I was to work the other way, I've got to do some different adding. So for 30%, I may want to add my 10 and my 20. Or I could have done 3 lots of my 10. 60% is going to be double that. And now you'll see, with just a few quick mental calculations, I've got loads of different percentages. Now if I look up to this branch, if my 100% was 70, now I'm thinking about what 50% would be. Well, half of that would be 35. And to find 25%, I'm going to be halving that again, 17.5. For 75%, it's going to be adding those two together. So if I was to add, if I add these two together, I get 52.5. Did pause and do a brief jotting there. Always fine to do that. Going back to my 50 then, because I've got another branch here, 50% was 35. Now 10 times less than that would give me my 5%, 3.5. And to get 95%, I want to take away 3.5 from my starting number, which would give me 66.5. Okay, so now I've filled in my whole thing, I can use my information to help me to find any percentage I want. So I wanted to find 52%, so I can use my 50%, which was 35, and add on my 2%, which was 1.4, which altogether, if I add those together, gives me 36.4. So some of you might be looking at this percentage change and thinking, well, that doesn't make much sense to me, and I don't see why I would use that when I could use a calculator. Well, you can just use a calculator, but this is a useful tool for if you didn't have one available, or for if you wanted to try to think of the links between all the percentages that you're doing. So they are useful to have, even though it takes a little bit longer. There you go.